side to be still alive in the legislature?
Yeah, I believe that was the 19th of, no, it was earlier than that even.
Of
They
April
have
or
to be
March? Go ahead.
April.
Okay.
It was a date in April. I think it was maybe the 14th. I can't remember now,
Yeah.
but they had to get out of committee.
Right. So, Shannon, what happened with what is it, 2120? Do you know?
2021.
2021. Did it move?
Yeah, it's in revenue now.
Okay, it's in, yeah, got it. And what about 3375 moved
Yes.
out of committee.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that today. What a great segue. Thanks. You guys are,
Hey, great.
you're hired. I love it. I'm going to go ahead and get going. I think we're going to be kind of lean. I've got a lot of, quite a few messages from folks who are out and about today. So thank you all for signing in. As a reminder, we do, I'm just recording this to my computer, so be aware of that. And we will get the slide decks from today's presentation out to our listserv. So if somebody who missed the presentation but would like it, they can absolutely get that from us. We are going to be featuring a presentation of Oregon's Department of Energy Biennial Energy Report that was last updated last year. We'll get started at that at about 11:30 after we just kind of go through a general update here for y'all. Ocean, I believe everyone on the call today is familiar with Ocean, so we don't need to revisit our mission statement or our purpose. But a lot has happened since we've last spoken. Organizationally, we have been recognized by the IRS as a 501c3 nonprofit. We're still promoting our front-loaded stakeholder engagement. And our goal remains to inform and influence coastal energy projects and policies while they're in their earliest formative stages so we can maximize the benefits to Oregon citizens, ecology, and economy. On the organizational side as well, we have relocated and revised our website. So you can find us at Oregon Energy Alliance. And Alyssa Pruis is on the call with us today. She's been helping us with that. And with respect to our board of directors, we were very pleased that our very own board member, Kyle Stevens, who's our workforce development chair, he was appointed by Governor Brown and then confirmed by the Senate as the International Port of Coos Bay's newest commissioner.
Yeah.
In labor, we continue to work with the Blue-Green Alliance, Oregon Building Trades, and the IBEW to develop an Oregon offshore wind labor memorandum of understanding. Blue-Green Alliance is also getting some MOUs from the East Coast for us to look at so we can kind of craft based on what we're seeing over there. We've been very busy in terms of outreach. We've provided offshore wind briefing updates to the Association of Oregon Public Ports, the Association of Oregon Counties, many of our Oregon legislators, the Pacific Northwest Crabbers and Towers Association, and the Oregon's Ocean Policy Advisory Council. Last month, we were panelists for UCI's Offshore Wind East and West Coast Implementation Summit. And specifically,
you're all good. Okay. I'm
Oh,
gonna order Grand Central for lunch today and have it
let me
delivered.
see.
Yeah, do you want anything?
Yeah, I'll just have to look at what they do.
No
Yeah.
problem. When you get a chance, just take a look.
Somebody
and then I'll put the order
needs
in so
to
it can
mute.
get delivered and we'll be
Let's see. I'm gonna find you. Is that Whitney? Maybe. There we go. Okay. See if that takes care of it. Anyhow, Ocean was joined by a representative from Redwood down in Humboldt on specifically strategies for community engagement and communication. And we're still moving forward, looking ahead as the vaccinations start to roll out. We have had in our strategic plan for the last year and a half a desire to implement a strategy of coastal faces and community places to complement the work that the federal and state agencies are doing by really getting out there, boots on the ground, to talk to folks about the offshore wind planning that's currently going on. Federally, there's been a lot of activity. One of the last things to occur in 2020, the stimulus bill specifically created a standalone offshore wind investment tax credit. This is 30% for any projects where construction begins before 2026. And what that means, construction begins specifically, is there's a safe harbor for projects in which at least 5% of the total cost of the project has been spent by the end of 2025. That is relevant in the moves that we are supporting here at the state level, and we'll get back to that in a moment. Also, just in this last 3 weeks, we've had the Biden administration's press conference on jumpstarting offshore wind energy, specifically to create jobs, and more specifically to create union jobs. That's the messaging coming from the Biden administration. And then following up with that in the jobs plan, specifically to advance ambitious wind energy projects to create good paying union jobs. Lots of focus there. Ocean has been collaborating with the Middlebury Institute for the last year and was able to provide some comment on their legislation, federal legislation, that's based on a comprehensive ocean climate action plan. Last week, Ocean was able to lead Middlebury Institute's delegation in a meeting with the United States Department of Energy. And the key messages that we received from United States Department of Energy was a reaffirmation of the national goal to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And more specific to the Department of Energy, that they have some very new significant goals around equity, communities, and deployment that are unlike anything they've ever seen in previous administrations. And they really do have a desire to engage with fence-line communities, but don't really know how to do that. Our message is, Ocean's message to cue up the meeting, was the importance of our national labs and the work that they are doing that has been funded by BOEM out here on the West Coast, that the grid values of offshore wind are not only helping to inform our deliberations around offshore wind, but also helping to inform the potential capacity of grid modeling for the entire Western grid. We were calling for investments not only in transmission planning, but in long-term transmission infrastructure. We advocated for investments in coexistence by design, noting that our very own Oregon State University is really well poised to work with our national labs, industry, and Oregon's fishers and conservationists for this coexistence by design. And in terms of Department of Energy's goals around environmental justice, that Ocean stands ready to engage fence line communities in this just transition, specifically out here on Oregon's coast. We are preparing to follow up with our delegates, the legislative delegates in the Pacific Northwest, reinforcing those messages that we delivered to the agency, specifically around coexistence by design, Western grid modeling support from our national labs, the United States Department of Defense requesting that they engage in some pre-call area conflict consultation. What we've learned in our conversations with US Department of Defense is that until specific projects are advanced to a level that there's a pretty refined footprint, they won't engage in formal consultation for conflict. Some of you might recall that we've seen this play out to the south of us in California's central call area that was fairly well established and now has some significant conflicts with Department of Defense. So we have asked that they consider some upfront consultation with BOEM and DLCD to get a higher level of resolution on where those conflicts may be as BOEM and DLCD are shaping up our call areas. And then finally, that fence line community engagement. Ocean is really, really happy that we have come into an agreement with Davis Wright Tremaine, a notable law firm very active in the Pacific Northwest in this area. And they're providing us with pro bono legal consultation as well as strategy development in our federal delegation work.
Shannon?
Yes.
Shannon, question for you. So in several of these slides, you've used the word fence line community. Now, can you just explain that? I've never seen that word used before.
Yeah, and that was brought up by U.S. Department of Energy. Thanks for mentioning that, Bill. So that's our tagline. I guess that's who we are. Department of Energy is looking for, now remember our new Energy Secretary Granholm has a very specific strategy based on her previous experience as the governor of Michigan. And her strategy is to look at communities that are disparate, that are not really finding success or their role in a clean energy, modern economy. And arguably the south coast of Oregon is like that. There are many communities all over the US there. And she is directing the Department of Energy at the federal level to focus on those communities that are kind of at the fence line, otherwise looking to other communities that might be geographically right next to them that are quite engaged and quite successfully engaged in a modern, clean economy. And looking for ways that those fence line communities can benefit from this just energy transition as they move forward. One example that was given is down in Long Beach, California, some work that has been done there. There's another example of a community that's up in Washington State. And really, Department of Energy is just asking for folks that are engaged in grassroots work with these types of communities to step up to the plate and help them and partner with them. So that's a good question. That's the best definition I can come up with right now, and that's just based on the context of how it was presented. In the regional planning arena, recall that the Northwest Power Plan that is still scheduled to be published later on this year is still in development. Thank goodness Northwest Energy Coalition has been doing amazing work there, and has invited Ocean repeatedly to continue participating in their meetings with both staff and the council as they're developing the plan. Ocean has been advocating for offshore wind to be noted as the emerging technology, as well as the inclusion of low frequency, high consequence events in future energy planning. That's a pretty loaded statement. What that means is currently our energy planning activities are based, depending on who's doing the planning, they're based on some level of grid reliability. It's a percentage of time that the grid is allowed, so to speak, to be out statistically. So they're looking forward and trying to meet that target. And Ocean and others, but we've really been leading the charge that, you know, if not in this plan, then in subsequent plans, we really should be thinking about these lower frequency events that result in catastrophic outages. Think about what we've seen in Texas. You can think about what we have seen from our own outages that we've experienced in the Pacific Northwest in the last 2 years, and saying, you know, really they're not as low frequency as they used to be. Maybe we should rethink that. But big thanks again to Northwest Energy Coalition for their work there and for including us. We continue to comment. Last round of comments were submitted last month for the Oregon Renewable Energy Siting Assessment. And we are getting ready to gear back up in the PUC space. POET is taking the lead in offshore wind representation in that space, having conversations with staff regarding educating on the opportunities there and the grid values. And we've got the capacity docket that's currently open. We're gearing up for resource adequacy and talking to PacifiCorp about their integrated resource planning. On the legislative front, we've been pretty busy. We've been tracking Renewable Northwest Regional Transmission Organization Study Bill, which we support. This would direct the Oregon's Department of Energy to evaluate the costs and benefits of Oregon stepping in to participate in some kind of a regional transmission organization. There is a renewable hydrogen bill that we have been supporting. That was Renewable Hydrogen Alliance bill moving forward. We have been providing testimony on the various approaches to 100% clean energy bills. And of course, we've got our own bill, House Bill 3375, which, as Bill and Michael were discussing earlier, was passed out of the House Energy and Environment Committee with a unanimously, actually, which is pretty unique for that committee, with a do pass recommendation to the floor. So now we're waiting for our
Very good sign.
on the House floor. What was that, Bill?
Yes. Very good sign. Out
Yes.
unanimously.
So to just give you a little bit more context, because of course we're getting a lot of input from those who support or oppose this bill, and trying to understand more of what the context is. This is where BOEM is at. It sounds like maybe we might be in a position for call areas to be announced for the Oregon Task Force by the end of this year. And that continues through their process. We'll keep moving forward there. It's a very traditional public involvement model where a lot of the more in-depth external participation happens a bit farther down the road after developers have successfully bid on leases and start designing up what the project's going to look like. This is a relevance to Ocean. Our model is to complement that traditional model with what we're doing right now, which is advocating for more high levels of external participation earlier on in the process. Remember that last year we learned that Oregon's existing transmission system may be able to accommodate somewhere between 2 and 3 gigawatts of floating wind electricity, has the potential benefits to strengthen our coastal grids, and also allow for some renewable energy integration more from the eastern and central part of the state by freeing up some transmission capacity. That work is being furthered by National Renewable Energy Laboratory to assess the potential offshore wind energy grid values. This is part of the slide deck that I presented to the House Committee of Energy and Environment. That kind of shows in very gross terms what Oregon's role is in the Pacific Northwest energy sector. We send our ratepayer dollars go out for electrons to flow in. The offshore wind opportunity, if we are successfully able to integrate offshore wind into our existing transmission system, is that we can not only service some of our needs, some of our loads from that offshore wind, but as I said, it also may release some transmission in the central and eastern part of the state so we can build even more resources here. We still have the opportunity with renewable hydrogen. There's a lot of interest in that globally as well as in the Pacific Northwest. And we're starting to see that drawn as potentially an opportunity for decarbonization of the maritime sector as well as long-haul transportation. Of course, there's a lot of economic development potential, both for the wind if it's developed off our coast, but also to service and supply any wind development in the Pacific. And naturally, there are barriers, potential barriers to offshore wind development, specifically with our fishers that are out there using some of the same waters, our shippers, our wildlife. And if we are to get over something that develop in excess of what our existing transmission can accommodate, then there's also the barrier of planning and investment for long-term high voltage deep sea transmission to the California market. So that's kind of the context for the House Bill 3375. The idea is to complement the work that BOEM is doing, that DLCD is doing in a leadership role with BOEM, recognize that there are benefits to Oregon getting engaged in planning for the benefit of Oregonians. And it signals some immediate federal and private investment into Oregon's renewable energy supply chain, workforce development, and it provides legislators with a timely update on Oregon's offshore wind opportunities to help inform their next steps. Real specifically, the scope of the bill is pretty narrow. It focuses on Oregon's Department of Energy. It directs the Department of Energy to conduct a literature review, to consult with other state, regional, and national agencies on the potential of integrating up to 3 gigawatts of offshore wind, to hold 2 or more public meetings, and then to provide a summary of findings back to Oregon's legislative body by 2022. So that kind of sets the stage for our presentation here. Really happy to have Jason Seirman, who's a senior policy analyst with our Department of Energy, who has graciously made time for us. Our Department of Energy has been high in demand to support all of these big question, legislative, very contentious big questions legislatively. And a lot of them have to do with energy in Oregon. So really appreciate Jason and Odo's staff for making the time to put together this presentation and join us today. I'm going to get out of my slideshow here and let Jason take the helm. Let's see, Jason, you should be in good shape. Let's make sure.
All right, everybody. Let's
there.
see here. I'm going to try to share my screen. How is that popping up?
Looks good.
All right, so everybody sees a big ocean, right?
Got it.
Okay, let me just make sure I have my controls dialed in here. Okay, well, hi everyone. I'm Jason Seirman with the Oregon Department of Energy, or ODO as we're commonly referred to, and thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with everyone in the ocean audience today. Shannon asked me to give an overview of ODO's 2020 Biennial Energy Report, basically the big picture of what our energy report is and how different aspects of it could be a useful resource for this ocean group and all your efforts around offshore wind. With that in mind, here's an overview of the topics I'll touch on today, including an introduction to the Oregon Department of Energy. It should take about 30 minutes to cover the slides, and then we'll have another 30 minutes for discussion and questions and answers. So I was thinking we should save most questions for the end. And I'm also happy to pause on slides to help answer clarifying questions people may have as I'm speaking. And of course, we can always go back to slides during our Q&A time to help with questions or topics folks may want to discuss further amongst the group. So here's a bit of background on ODO before we get into the 2020 report. Our vision statement is leading Oregon to a safe, equitable, clean, and sustainable future. This used to be our mission statement, but that's since changed after going through a multi-year strategic planning effort. So now we have a new mission statement. The Oregon Department of Energy helps Oregonians make informed decisions and maintain a resilient and affordable energy system. We advance solutions to shape an equitable, clean energy transition, protect the environment and public health, and responsibly balance energy needs and impacts for current and future generations. And what we do is our position statement that supports how we achieve our mission with 5 pillars that define our work. The 2020 Energy Report stands upon these pillars, primarily the central repository for energy information, and also energy education and technical assistance, which are also 2 of the pillars motivating the department's interests in offshore wind. Importantly, our new strategic plan also prioritizes many considerations surrounding diversity, equity, and cooperative engagement. And this includes acknowledgement of and engagement with the indigenous tribes and bands that have been part of the Northwest landscape and throughout Oregon for time immemorial. ODO recognizes and has internalized the fact that it's impossible to truly understand Oregon's past and plan for Oregon's future without having an essential understanding of the rich culture, contributions, and perspectives of Native people. So now that folks know some background about ODO, let's shift into the 2020 Biennial Energy Report, starting with why we write them. In 2017, the legislature passed a law that requires the department to develop an energy report every 2 years to inform local, state, regional, and federal energy policy development, along with informing energy planning and investments. ODO's first report was in 2018, and that edition provided deep policy briefs, policy dives, some might say, on a handful of important energy topics being discussed by many at that time. One of the big topics then was resilience, which I know is of interest to many in this group based on the conversations I've had with Shannon and others on offshore wind. While I don't have a specific slide on resilience today, please know that there's an extensive write-up on that topic in the 2018 report that everyone can refer to. Our second report was issued in November 2020 and took a different approach. Rather than longer briefs on a smaller set of topics, it covers many more energy topics through relatively shorter briefs. Each topic is self-contained, so you could think of it as a very long magazine, where you can read it cover to cover, or just the articles that interest you most. Some statutory directives frame the content of these reports, but in scoping them, we also reached out to energy stakeholders and the public to learn about subjects that people are interested in hearing about. We appreciated hearing input from Ocean and many other stakeholders regarding the topics for our 2020 report, and we're very thankful for all that. And with all that input in mind, we tried to pick topics that would help inform a broad audience, including discussions happening in the legislature. And as we hoped, many of the topics in the 2020 report have matched up with many of the energy bills that have been introduced during the current 2021 legislative session, including a few bills on offshore wind. So we heard Shannon do a great recap of those. Here's a picture similar to what you'll see when you visit the energy report online. As you can see from the table of contents, there's a lot of information. 62 articles or separate pieces in total that reflect the work of 43 people and 24 authors. The table of contents also offers the easiest way to find the various topics you may want to read about. And each of these titles are also hyperlinked, so you can go straight to the topic in the report that you're interested in. The report is primarily organized using 4 broad categories of individual pieces. The Energy by the Numbers section offers several pieces that help tell the big picture story of energy in Oregon, like the ways energy is produced and used across the state. The Energy 101 section covers fundamental information on specific energy topics, like how the transmission system works, for example. The section of resource and technology reviews has short pieces that offer high-level snapshots of various energy resources and technologies by describing them, summarizing their current status of adoption in Oregon, and referencing interesting facts and figures. And the policy brief section consists of deeper dives on emerging trends and hot topics across the energy sector. I highlighted in yellow the handful of topics I'll give a brief overview of today, though many other topics could also be of interest and relevant to offshore wind. For example, offshore wind may benefit from being paired with some form of storage. So I flagged the tech review for utility scale energy storage with a red arrow here. And that review gives a snapshot of the recent rise of batteries across Oregon and its investor-owned utilities. So here's an easier to read summary of the topics that were highlighted on the last slide. And these are all the topics Shannon and I thought would be good to highlight for today's presentation, considering Ocean's interests in offshore wind. This quick snapshot from the Energy by the Numbers section is a great illustration showing where Oregon currently sits with respect to clean energy. It shows the overall resource mix Oregon utilities used to supply electricity to their customers in 2018. The large hydro numbers are predominantly used to serve customers of Oregon's consumer-owned utilities, and the large coal numbers are predominantly used to serve customers of Oregon's investor-owned utilities. You can see how much onshore wind and solar currently supplies Oregonians with electricity. Wind supplies less than 5%, which is slightly more than nuclear, and solar supplies less than 2%. And the big takeaway here is that there's a lot of opportunity to meet Oregon's decarbonization goals with the development of new renewables. Opportunities for more onshore wind and solar, yes, but also opportunity for offshore wind. Here we see a snapshot taken from one of the 2 pieces from the energy report on clean and renewable energy standards. One is a 101 that provides a great summary of the national landscape of state commitments to renewable and clean energy targets. This 101 also discusses how these targets function, what their goals are. And for example, talks about how Oregon currently has 50% RPS goal by 2040 for its largest utilities. The second is a deeper dive policy brief that covers the recent trends in states increasing their RPS targets and adopting 100% clean targets, which includes California's and Washington's commitments to 100% clean by 2045. The deeper dive explores the difference between 100% RPS and 100% clean electricity standards, including how specific technology carve-outs can be removed or added to these standards. And it also explores the goals of these types of standards and some of the trade-offs, opportunities, and challenges involved with achieving them. The policy brief concludes with several key questions and considerations that could help Oregon policymakers and stakeholders like Ocean during conversations about increasing Oregon's RPS goals or committing to a 100% clean goal. Another topic with a nexus to offshore wind are the region's recent and ongoing conversations about resource adequacy. These conversations are developing relatively quickly in response to the relatively rapid pace at which regional coal retirements are occurring and being planned for. The 2020 report has 2 write-ups on this topic. One is a 101 that explains a lot of the basics around resource adequacy, which is really just a different term for long-term reliability, and the other is a deeper dive policy brief. The 101 explains what resource adequacy is, how it relates to capacity planning for new generation, and why it's so critical to keeping the lights on. It also gives an introduction to the conversations taking place on this topic and draws connections to how storage could help optimize the total capacity needed to ensure resource adequacy. The policy brief goes on to identify many key technical factors that can go into an assessment of resource adequacy and explores at depth policy questions that lay the foundation for these assessments. So in other words, the policy brief frames up key foundational questions and then discusses how different answers to these questions can influence the different ways resource adequacy can be evaluated. And here's a snapshot of the coal retirements mentioned in the last slide that are driving conversations about regional capacity and resource adequacy. This shows the lost regional coal capacity between now and 2030, which is very helpful context about the need for new renewables and the potential opportunity for new offshore wind development, especially to the extent offshore wind may be able to consistently generate electricity across many hours of the day, including critical peak hours and also at night. Another topic from the energy report with impacts for offshore wind are the ongoing efforts toward evolving the region's wholesale electricity markets. For example, how wholesale markets operate, whether markets are centralized or not, and the average price of wholesale energy can all have significant impacts on how generation and transmission is built across the region, including impacts to the potential costs and risks of onshore wind development. So we have a piece on this topic in the energy report that covers the basics and starts off with describing how Oregon doesn't currently operate under a centralized market system like other parts of the country do. The current status of how wholesale markets operate across the country is illustrated on that map on the left. So for example, California operates under a statewide centralized market called CAISO, or the California Independent System Operator. And other areas operate under independent and centralized RTOs, or regional transmission organizations. ISOs and RTOs are the two main types of centralized markets across the US, and these centralized markets control both the dispatch of resources and the transmission planning across very wide areas. These centralized market systems are in contrast to how things are done in the Pacific Northwest, where the dispatch of resources and transmission planning are controlled by individual utilities and the Bonneville Power Administration. This piece of the report goes on to explain CAISO's energy imbalance market, or EIM, and how many Pacific Northwest utilities, including BPA, have voluntarily joined the EIM. The EIM is a very short-term energy market that helps address real-time energy imbalances across the West. It helps optimize existing generation and transmission assets by leveraging pooled resources from participating entities. So in other words, the EIM helps with some optimization. Also discussed are CAISO's efforts to establish a regional extended day-ahead market, or EDAM, a market that EIM participants could voluntarily choose to join. A day-ahead market allows for a more optimized scheduling of resources the day before they're needed to operate, which helps decrease the costs and increase the certainty associated with different resource commitments. So in other words, a regional EDAM would help with even more optimization. Increased optimization can lower the cost of integrating renewables and can help free up transmission congestion that currently exists, especially during peak hours. And generation and transmission optimization is essentially what an RTO helps accomplish. An RTO for the Pacific Northwest, or an extension of an existing RTO to include the Pacific Northwest, is an interesting possibility that could help with regional transmission planning and the development of new regional transmission lines. Both of these would likely help the development of new renewables, both onshore and potentially offshore as well. And while the formation of an RTO is not currently in the works for Oregon, it's noteworthy that there's a proposed bill under consideration by the Oregon legislature. I think Shannon touched on this. And that bill would have Odo lead a study of the benefits, opportunities, and challenges relating to the development or expansion of an RTO in the state. So I encourage folks to stay tuned on this developing topic. Here's a snapshot from the Transmission 101 piece in the 2020 report that shows BPA's transmission system and describes the largest owners and operators of transmission lines in and around Oregon. BPA is the largest and operates approximately 75% of all the transmission in the Pacific Northwest. And as we can see, BPA has a substantial amount of transmission that delivers power to the Oregon coast, which could serve as connection points for offshore wind. PacifiCorp operates transmission across 6 western states, including a lot in Oregon, and also with some notable reaches spanning out to some areas of the Oregon coast. And other entities also have transmission in Oregon, just far less than the entities listed here. Though I will flag that Coos Curry Electric Co-op also owns a small segment of coastal transmission between Gold Beach and Brookings. For those that may not venture into the weeds of the Pacific Northwest transmission system very often, let me preface this slide with a relatively common refrain I often hear: there isn't enough transmission. And this is because transmission line capacity can be a scarce resource with both physical and contractual constraints, especially during peak load hours. And in a way, transmission constraints can be thought of as energy bottlenecks that lead to congestion, similar to how highway constraints can lead to vehicle congestion, especially during rush hour traffic. So with that in mind, it's always critical to consider ways to optimize the electricity traffic on existing lines. This helps maximize the use of what we already have, and also helps inform discussions about where and how much new transmission may need to be built. Optimization is especially important when considering all the costs and risks of building new lines. New transmission lines are often billion-dollar projects costing millions of dollars per mile, and we can't forget about the increasing risk of wildfires, especially after all the fires we experienced in and around Oregon last year. So this is a short list of ways to help increase optimization, and adding generation or batteries in strategic locations is a good one to touch on. Perhaps counterintuitive, but adding generation or batteries at particular points on the transmission system can actually help offload other parts of the transmission system. So for example, a lot of Oregon customers currently receive power from generation located east of the Cascades. This means a lot of electricity flows from east to west on existing transmission lines to get to Oregon's big load centers in the Willamette Valley. And this means many of the east to west transmission pathways can experience significant congestion depending on the season and time of day. So therefore, the concept of adding new generation in Western Oregon, like perhaps offshore wind, is interesting to explore because it could help mitigate some of the large east to west flows of transmission traffic. It could help free up some existing transmission east of the Cascades for new renewables to be built. It could even improve the reliability of the coastal grid. Another topic with an access to offshore wind is hydrogen, a topic that the Energy Report explores through the title of Power to Gas. While hydrogen technology is not in and of itself a new concept, it's a technology that's getting a lot of new attention recently. While hydrogen can be produced from coal and gas, it can also be produced from renewables. And after it's produced, hydrogen can pair well with the energy demands of heavy and long-haul modes of transportation, like marine vessels, heavy-duty truck fleets, and even aircraft potentially. The 2020 report has a lot of information about hydrogen, and this is another topic with 2 write-ups. One is a technology review that explains the basics of hydrogen with references to a few ambitious pilot projects in and around Oregon, like Northwest Natural and eWeb's partnership on a project, and a project with Douglas County PUD. I'll add that I also read some news last month that Tacoma Power has designed a pilot demand response project, and that would have a specific non-firm electric rate that would be available to customers producing electrofuels. So this type of project could also help spur the flexible production of renewable or green hydrogen in and around the Tacoma area. And the second write-up on this topic is a policy brief that takes a deeper dive into exploring hydrogen markets, use cases, costs, its development across the world, and its potential for Oregon. So since I understand that Ocean is considering how hydrogen could pair well with offshore wind, this write-up could be another one to explore and refer to. Last but not least, there's also a piece on offshore wind, and since this is the focus of Ocean, I've included a few more slides to give a more complete overview of what's discussed in that section of the report. As a reminder, the report is written for a relatively broad and lay audience, which could make it an appealing resource for Ocean to use and refer to as needed. With that in mind, the offshore wind piece starts with the basics about the 2 different types of offshore wind technology being developed and planned for across the globe and around the US. It discusses the use cases for fixed versus floating offshore wind and describes why floating offshore wind is the technology that could be developed off Oregon's coast and how this differs from the fixed bottom offshore wind technology developing more rapidly on the East Coast. Of course, the write-up also notes how NREL's technical analysis characterizes the wind speeds off the southern Oregon and northern California coast as world-class, with some of the strongest winds in the world, not to mention the US. This information could be helpful to support education on why there's such a significant interest in offshore wind development off Oregon's coast, and why it could be such a valuable, and why it could be so valuable to the state and the region for achieving renewable and clean energy goals. So for the most part, all the slides before this had graphics that were taken straight out of the report. And this star graphic is one I created just for today because I thought it'd be useful to help visualize 5 key opportunities with offshore wind that were included in the offshore wind piece. The star shows 5 values offshore wind could have for the power grid, with the additional key value of economic development shown as a non-power value. Strong, consistent, and complementary wind speeds, scale, transmission, and the potential for increased reliability and resilience were all touched on in the report. I should note that the potential value of onshore transmission relief wasn't explicitly called out in the report, but it's certainly bound up with the idea that offshore wind has the potential to be more cost effective at larger and larger scales. And this is an idea that was touched on in the write-up. And it's also worth noting that the onshore transmission implications for offshore wind are currently being studied by NREL. I think Shannon mentioned that study. And that report is likely to be published later this summer. The big takeaway here is that while many of these values may already be known to most of this ocean audience, they're still very important to educate others on. And I hope the offshore wind piece of the energy report can help with these efforts. Again, you won't see this 4-pointed diamond in the write-up, but I thought it'd be a creative way to help visualize some of the key challenges for offshore wind that were identified in the report, along with some of the opportunities that could help mitigate some of these challenges. The point of the diamond, no pun intended there, is to help illustrate the idea that these challenges can interact and have cross tensions with each other. I'm not going to talk through each of these factors on the slide, but this could be something we circle back to during our Q&A time potentially. I think the big takeaway here is that several challenges were identified in the report, along with opportunities to help overcome them, and that each of these points here could be helpful to ocean and educating people on some of the trade-offs with offshore wind, including the potential benefits of scaling up bigger and bigger, the potential benefits of shared ocean transmission, the potential benefits of having a regional dialogue on the opportunities and challenges with offshore wind development. The write-up concludes with an overview of the jurisdictions that control the leasing and permitting of offshore wind. While it's an overview and not extremely detailed, I think it hits the middle ground of being relatively thorough and could be one of the more valuable aspects of the write-up, depending on how ocean may wish to use it. For example, the section could help raise awareness to a lay audience about some of the nuances of the federal and state permitting processes for offshore wind development. Nuances like how just because floating offshore wind would fall under federal jurisdiction, that doesn't mean Oregon wouldn't still have input into the federal permitting process. So for example, under Oregon's coastal management program, the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development also performs federal consistency reviews for projects falling outside of Oregon's jurisdiction, but that are located within the 500 fathom depth contour, which includes areas where floating offshore wind would likely be developed. The last section also gives an overview of the BOEM leasing and permitting process for offshore wind, which includes some background information on BOEM's prior activity with Oregon from 2011 to 2018, and also has a recap of BOEM's more recent and ongoing public engagement activities through its Oregon Intergovernmental Task Force. With transmission being such a critical aspect to the development of offshore wind, I thought this slide and the next slide could be helpful to exploring that topic and potentially help spark discussions during our Q&A time. This slide shows some novel ocean transmission ideas that have been explored for California by Humboldt State University. And what we essentially see here is the idea of a backbone ocean transmission line paralleling the California coast. The studies from Humboldt State University's Schatz Energy Research Center were footnoted in the energy report's offshore wind piece, and the reference was within the context of how the areas of the West Coast where the offshore winds are strongest are also areas of the West Coast with relatively less developed coastlines. So this novel idea of a backbone ocean transmission line caught my attention as a possible solution to a few challenges. For one, the less developed coastline of Northern California and Southern Oregon are likely to have existing limits to their onshore transmission infrastructure. And this means there's a limit that beyond which building more megawatts of offshore wind would require building more onshore transmission infrastructure to deliver those megawatts to where the bigger load centers are. And two, planning and building a backbone ocean transmission line would allow the opportunity for multiple offshore wind projects to tie into it. And this could help spread transmission costs and risks across multiple projects and also give investors and developers more certainty around costs and risks, which are very critical to securing financing. This type of scenario would be in contrast to individual projects having to build their own individual transmission lines to interconnect to the onshore grid, which could be more costly and more risky, and could also result in a potpourri of more random interconnection lines running to shore rather than a more strategic, certain, and limited amount. The big takeaway for this slide is that backbone transmission lines are an option for offshore wind development, and the next slide will help us explore how backbone transmission lines on land have helped support the development of onshore generation. Take a little sip of water here. Thank you. The goal of this slide is to help draw out the significance of backbone transmission lines and how they can play a critical role in the development of new generation. While the lines that we see on this map may look like roads, they're actually the larger high voltage transmission lines in Oregon that are greater than 345 kilovolts. And importantly, we can notice how there aren't any of these high voltage transmission lines spanning out to the coast. There isn't a textbook definition for what constitutes a backbone transmission line, but thinking of them as higher voltage lines and seeing where they are located can help us, and exploring how they got there can help us appreciate their significance in interconnecting and transferring large megawatts and gigawatts of generation across the grid. And some might even say the question of when and where to develop backbone transmission lines could boil down to the age-old question of what comes first, the chicken or the egg, but just with respect to transmission or generation. So let's explore this question relative to the development of onshore transmission, which might help inform some of the thinking around potential transmission options for offshore wind. Okay, let's pretend we're Bob Ross and paint in some happy onshore generation there. So now we see most, if not all, the generation in and around Oregon, including some of the largest generators in the region, which are the large hydropower dams along the Columbia River that were built before the 70s. These are the large blue circles, and they drove the construction of several of the larger transmission lines that were built through the gorge to deliver significant megawatts and gigawatts of hydropower to the large population centers west of the Cascades. So in this instance, the addition of large generators basically drove the construction of large transmission. But this also meant that a lot of the large transmission lines along the I-84 area were in existence and available to support additional generation projects. For example, some of the large coal and gas plants that have been developed along the I-84 area since the 70s benefited from having accessible transmission already in place, and so did the more recent wind development. The coal plants are shown in red circles, gas plants in yellow circles, and the more recent wind projects are shown in the smaller turquoise circles. And having existing transmission lines already in place has also helped support the construction of generation outside the gorge in I-84 area too. For example, we can see a few yellow and red circles showing where relatively large natural gas and coal plants have been built, closer to the larger 500 kV lines running up and down I-5. So there's two big takeaways from this canvas. In some instances, developing large generation projects drives the construction of new large transmission lines. And in other instances, having large transmission lines already in place can be a factor that helps determine where generation projects are developed. Next, I'm going to wipe the canvas and paint in a fresh new map that will show all the transmission lines in Oregon. So I hope people can see that. Now we see that there are in fact transmission lines reaching out to the coast over the coastal range and then up and down the coast as well. But these are all lower voltage lines, mostly 115 kV lines with a few 230 kV lines. And now let's layer on a happy little graphic for illustrative purposes that's taken from one of BOEM's presentations to the Oregon Task Force. This added layer shows existing subsea data and communication cables, and more importantly, all the various colors show the strength of average offshore wind speeds. Red and orange areas as the strongest. Green areas are still relatively strong, but not the strongest. And with this happy painting, we can visualize the complete picture of the current transmission infrastructure across Oregon. And we could potentially use this painting to help explore how the chicken or egg question could apply to offshore wind. For example, here are some questions that could be asked. And some of these questions are being explored by the NREL study I mentioned on the prior slide with the 5-pointed star. Are there locations where existing onshore transmission lines may be able to support some amount of offshore wind development? Perhaps areas with less of a need to upgrade existing onshore transmission relative to other areas? Would developing a lot of offshore wind where ocean winds are strongest require new upgrades to existing onshore transmission lines, or potentially require new higher voltage lines? Could a backbone ocean transmission line help optimize the potential development of offshore wind? Perhaps in ways that could help minimize the need to upgrade existing onshore transmission lines, maybe reduce the need to build new onshore transmission, and help optimize the costs, risks, and impacts of potential offshore wind development. So those are some questions. At this point, I'm approaching the limits of what I read about the transmission options for interconnecting offshore wind to the grid. But I do think this type of big picture view can be helpful in conversations about the opportunities and challenges involved with finding the most optimal and possibly even the most economical ways to plan for the potential development of offshore wind and its corresponding transmission needs. I think the main takeaway from this slide and the last slide are that there are many options when it comes to the potential planning scenarios for offshore wind, and that yes, new generation can often drive new transmission, but that transmission can also support the development of generation. So wrapping things up, here are a few key takeaways from Odo's 2020 Biennial Energy Report relating to offshore wind. First, how might offshore wind fit into current conversations? Conversations about modifying Oregon's renewable goals, conversations about resource adequacy in the context of increasing coal retirements and increasing constraints on the Pacific Northwest's abundant hydro system, and conversations about mitigating existing transmission constraints across Oregon and the larger Pacific Northwest region. Second, building new generation and transmission can be complicated and challenging for many reasons, not the least of which are costs and risks, and also the chicken or egg type dilemma. Could offshore wind help address the need for new renewables and new transmission in a novel way and with different trade-offs compared to the current status quo of onshore generation and transmission? And finally, as we saw on the last slide, transmission and generation are intertwined. So if offshore wind generation fits into some of the current conversations, including ways it may be able to contribute to mitigating onshore transmission congestion, then thinking about how ocean transmission lines could be planned to help optimize an increased growth of renewables, both onshore and offshore, is pretty important. For example, many Western states are going to need a tremendous amount of new renewables over the next 10 and 20 years to meet their clean energy commitments. And finding ways to meet these needs can be supported by regional conversations on how to best optimize existing transmission and/or optimize the building of new transmission to help support the growth of new renewables. And finally, here's a snapshot of the recent work Odo has done or is planning to relating to offshore wind. We're a state agency participating in BOEM's Oregon Intergovernmental Task Force, and I'm the lead contact there. We haven't been too involved with their early public engagement activities to date, but we're always available to BOEM and other stakeholders as a resource. And I also expect we may get more involved towards the end of this year when their efforts to identify call areas is expected to start ramping up. Odo is also nearing the final stages of an Oregon Renewable Energy Siting Assessment, a study focusing on the challenges and opportunities related to planning and developing renewable resources and transmission infrastructure in Oregon, which includes a high-level look at the potential development of offshore wind as well. In addition, Odo has participated in several technical working groups related to various NREL and PNNL studies. We helped with a few studies in 2019 and 2020, and this year we're continuing to support the 2021 NREL study looking at the transmission implications for interconnecting various scenarios of offshore wind into the power grid. And PNNL was also recently awarded funding from the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium to do another study relating to transmission options for interconnecting offshore wind to the power grid. Odo wrote a letter of support for this study and has offered to assist with PNNL's efforts as needed. And a few other areas where Odo is connecting on offshore wind are through quarterly meetings amongst a small group of state agencies led by Regional Solutions. And of course, we're also exploring the potential for a follow-up offshore wind piece for the 2022 Biennial Energy Report, the timing of which could dovetail nicely with the offshore wind study currently being considered by the Oregon legislature. So that's all I have, and thank you for your time. Hopefully my time was okay. I'm happy to answer questions or even just listen to others if there's any questions or comments during our Q&A time.
That was excellent. Thank you, Jason. Folks that are on the line, unless it just gets to be such a mad rush of questions for Jason, go ahead and just unmute yourself and ask away. Wow, you've left everyone just speechless. You covered it all so well.
You guys gave me too much time to talk. I don't know if it'd be helpful. I could put my camera on and take away the slides, or I don't know how is the best. But.
Jason, I have a question. How does the state go about looking at scenarios like 3 gigawatts or 30 gigawatts, how does, what's the process? I mean, what people will come together to make those kind of decisions?
It's a good question. Are you kind of thinking, do you have the proposed legislation in mind with that question, or like our offshore,
Well,
the
the
potential offshore wind study bill that we might get involved with?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think in that legislation, it's pretty specific with the number that we would look at. So I think that's helpful because we would probably be asking a question very similar to what you just asked if we didn't have that specific direction. I think you would start off with the technical resource potential. I think that's pretty well covered in the NREL analysis. So that can give you a really high number, potentially in the terawatts or certainly gigawatt number, or gigawatt numbers. But you have to kind of probably look at it in more bite-sized chunks and then trying to assess what it would take to land all of it. And so, I think the 3 gigawatt number is an interesting number. I've said 3 is a magic number kind of in passing sometimes, but ironically, it does kind of, wherever that coal slide was, it, not to really make an apples to apples comparison, but that's a decent number to kind of, maybe serve as a proxy for some disappearing coal too.
Thank you.
Sarah, are you still on the line? Sarah Corbus, I noticed you had a question in the chat. Didn't know if you wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, I am still on the line. I don't know if Jason is the right person to speak to it, but I do think it's an interesting thing to explore that, you're for Coastal Zone Management Act consistency. Usually if you have an unlisted activity, then you go through a whole process with the state, of course, in trying to evaluate consistency. But if the state is already considering what's going to happen in offshore wind, the state has the option to actually create things that are listed activities within its coastal zone management plan under CZMA and create enforceable policies that would be relevant to offshore wind, so that would reduce risk and uncertainty and have that thought process that happens in advance of having projects. Do you know, Jason, if there's been any talk about working on that at the state level?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I think this current legislation that's being considered, I think there's a floor session coming up. So we'll see where that goes. But I think that is kind of the point of that, certainly, and especially kind of all the work Shannon and Ocean is doing, and other groups on offshore wind. There's a lot of momentum behind this topic and this technology. The state hasn't come out with any kind of policy position on this. We're pretty technology agnostic at this point. I think it would certainly count in our RPS portfolio standards, but we haven't gone into conversations or anything about, actively planning for offshore wind, I think, in the way you're describing.
Do you know if there's a
maybe I could interject here?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Hi, this is Andy Lanier. I'm the Marine Affairs Coordinator for the Department of Land Conservation and Development. The state of Oregon did develop Part 5 of the Territorial Sea Plan, which covers marine renewable energy. And when it did so, it did update enforceable policies related to how the state would consider developments within state waters. But following that process, the state also requested, through what's called a geographic location description, the ability to review projects that fell within the 500 fathom contour, which is pretty close to the edge of where the planning area is, for marine renewable energy types. And so we would be able to look at our enforceable policies as a part of the Territorial Sea Plan and apply them to the elements of an offshore wind proposal where we have policies. So the state has asked for and already does have approval for the ability to review projects, especially where there are elements that interact with resources or uses that have been identified by the state through that effort. And it looks like Whitney provided a link to the GLD online. So you can look at that document to see the analysis the state has already conducted. That was actually completed several years back, as once we had completed our original Part 5 amendment process.
Thanks. That's really helpful. Do you know if there's any intention of additional modification to the Oregon Territorial Sea Plan, you know, as updating as you finish up more of your studies and things like that?
At this time, there are plans to amend the Territorial Sea Plan for cables that cross the Territorial Sea, but there is not a date, I guess. I shouldn't say that. There was a provision put into the Territorial Sea Plan saying from 7 years of adoption, or if the state reached a certain number or percentage of the territorial sea that was in a development status, it would take a look at the Marine Renewable Energy chapter again. But there is no immediate plan to do so. I think the time horizon is still a couple of years out. And most of the focus in planning as a part of the Territorial Sea Plan has been on state waters. And so I don't know that there would be a lot of support for redoing Part 5 just for the applicability to offshore wind.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. That's very helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks, Andy.
Does anyone have any other questions for Jason? Scrolling through the chat, pretty much I see a lot of great presentation, Jason. Thank you. Really helpful.
Okay, well, you know, I don't need to, you know, be anywhere for a little bit. I set aside time to linger. So if you guys think of any, or, you know, I don't know what's on the agenda other than this, if there's other things you guys talk about, you know, I'm happy to stay a fly on the wall. And if, you know, a question comes up in the next few minutes, I can linger on.
Great. Anybody else? When do you actually get started with the 2022 update? Do you wait until, will you start taking input on that in the end of this calendar year, or does it actually physically start at the beginning of 22?
I could answer that question in so many interesting ways. From my perspective, sometimes I feel like it never ends. We're always kind of thinking about it in the back of our head. But I think your question's probably more about outward reaching out, you know, stakeholder engagement, trying to kind of do a parallel effort to what we did last year, which I think, I don't know, I can't remember exactly when that started, but maybe the spring, maybe around now, of 2020 is when we may have started going out and actively seeking input for the topic kind of scoping. So I'm assuming that's kind of going to play out similarly in 2022. We may get ahead of it a little bit more by the end of this year. But certainly some of the study bills you referenced in your opening, if those blossom and, you know, make it through and are approved by the legislature, I think those are going to be some obvious topics we're going to touch on in the 2022 report. You know, take what we learn and what we hear from those reports and synthesize them into something that might be a little bit like I mentioned when I was giving my report, maybe something that's geared more towards a lay audience, and include that in the biennial energy report. So yeah, we're always thinking about topics. Feedback is always encouraged, even if we're not actively seeking out input, you know, if we're not in one of those phases where we're reaching out to folks. if something comes to mind, always send an email. We're good at keeping track of data.
I've got another,
This is
go for it, Bill.
this is Bill Bradbury. I had another question. I think mostly both for Jason and Shannon, and sort of talk again about what the Northwest Power and Conservation Council is doing about offshore wind in relation to their 5/20-year energy plan. I was on the council for a number of years.
Mhm.
Not on it anymore. But I'm just curious sort of they seem like a very logical place to sort of get this resource recognized. So I don't know exactly what my question is, but sort of what's the Power Council doing about it, if anything?
Shannon, you want me to take a shot?
Sure, and I'll fill in the gaps.
Okay, yeah. Let me start off with, we have another colleague. I have a colleague, I should say, that works with BPA and the Power Council more directly than I do. But I don't know that it takes him to answer that question. I think from last I know, they were looking at it as an emerging resource for the first time, maybe a year ago, 18 months ago,
Right.
while they were prepping for everybody else's knowledge, I guess, it sounds like, Bill obviously has a history with the council and maybe some more information under his belt, but the Power Council does a regional resource plan, which for anyone who knows what an integrated resource plan is, like an IRP that the utilities do, the Power Council basically does like a mega IRP for the region, if that helps visualize what Bill and I are talking about. And they do that every 5 years. So the last time they did it was in 2016 or 17, and I think they're coming out with their 2021 power plan. Is the timing on that sound right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
when they do that,
right.
yeah, and when they do that, there's kind of a cast of characters, so to speak, if you want to think of solar and wind as all like these role players in making the energy system work. And they look at the cast of characters and see who's ripe, who's got cost curves that are cost competitive with other technologies. And offshore wind, this is a good thing, not a bad thing, but it's a good thing because they just started looking at that this year. So that's the first time. So they've already started to do a little work on offshore wind. As I understand it, it's still in kind of the bucket of emerging technologies, which is kind of shorthand for saying it didn't get that deep of a look and it didn't make like the resource stack that they feed into their modeling.
Right.
Either that or it did make the resource stack and they modeled it and it wasn't coming out in any of the portfolio results. So they kind of maybe put it in their back pocket for next time.
Right.
So hopefully that's helpful.
It was kind of an interesting and eye-opening conversation for me to learn that it will have, as Jason stated, it will be mentioned in the narrative as an emerging resource, but it was really a kind of a coin flip between offshore wind and small batch nuclear. And at the end of the day, the nuclear was included just because the staffing was more knowledgeable there. The staff member that was really up to speed and tracking on offshore wind was hired by the offshore wind industry developers and is now doing that work on the East Coast. So it's important to stay in front of these folks. It's also really been eye-opening, and I guess that kind of gets into a follow-up comment for Jason and Department of Energy, how how much we need to advocate for our State Department of Energy, our regional planning, our Oregon's Public Utility Commission. All of these huge transformative changes are occurring in our energy sector, and they're not necessarily being met with resources at the agency level for staffing. So that's definitely something that Ocean and others have been trying to help advocate for. And that kind of cues up my question. Are you, Jason, aware of any direct conversations between Odo and either U.S. Department of Energy about, are you seeing any kind of inklings that there might be some more direct support from federal agency support, whether it's through U.S. Department of Energy or other, into Odo to support your work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the short answer is probably yes. We're seeing probably, the same kind of daylight shining through the current administration, the new administration's planning for clean energy targets and how to achieve those. I don't think there's any specifics that have come through on that yet. There's other groups other than the US DOE, or there's groups that are kind of symbiotic with that, and that the National Offshore Wind Research Consortium, they just gave some funding to PNNL. So I know there's a lot of interest in trying to figure out offshore wind, especially I think when it comes to floating technology, which is, I guess, maybe lack of a better word, the newer form of that technology. And as I understand it, that was there one or two operating projects in the world compared to maybe thousands of pedestal mount fixed bottom offshore wind. So I think where the support, I think offshore wind probably would like support across all dimensions, but maybe floating offshore wind could use a little bit more.
I hate to dominate the questions here, but I'll keep asking since we've got you. Does Department of Energy consult on any kind of a regular, are there any meetings on the West Coast or with other Western grid states that are regularly convened by, I don't know, one of the planning entities, or does Odo talk to your counterparts down in California and up in Washington?
Yeah, we do. It's more probably informal. I think there's a couple bodies that we might plug into on different topics. The Western Governors Association, or the WEC, both those kind of more regional groups have opportunities and talk about energy, different topics. I think I haven't heard much on offshore wind to date, but it's not to say that those conversations couldn't take place, or maybe it's already kind of bubbling up through people's thoughts that are more involved with those gatherings. California, I know, is looking at offshore wind. Department of Defense is also very keen on offshore wind, at least following that subject. So I think for whatever reason, whoever's pushing the agendas, whether it's advocates for offshore wind or people concerned about the implications for offshore wind, I think it's on people's radars more and more. And I think those conversations are likely to be had in the future.
Yeah, we see, granted, it's clearly such a different energy market, and we've got little teeny tiny states over there on the East Coast, but definitely the benefits of the states collaborating, both in terms of transmission and energy integration planning, but also all of that supply chain, workforce, port analysis development. Let's see, does anyone, thanks, thank you, Whitney, for letting me know I was sharing my calendar with everyone. Does
Yeah.
anyone have any other questions? Cool, well,
Shannon, I had one additional. In terms of transmission, one of the things that absolutely blew me away when I served on the Power Council was realizing that California has basically one organization, California ISO, that coordinates transmission. And Oregon and Washington and Idaho, Western Montana have probably, I think it would be accurate to say almost 25 different regional transmission organizations. And there's been some work to try to create more regional transmission organizations. So do you have some, Jason, do you have some sense of where that's at and what's happening with it?
Yeah, well, I think it's getting more attention. Just for some more background knowledge, the deregulation in the 90s by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the steps they took really kind of springboarded the value, I guess I'll call it, or the opportunity for value for these regional entities to exist. And after that, like right around the turn of the century, 2000-ish, that's when you first started seeing groups like CAISO or MISO or PJM, those kind of RTO, ISO areas start getting created. And it's getting more attention, not only just around here, maybe, if it is getting more attention around here. I think it is. I think it's safe to say it is. I mean, there's a study bill that just got passed by the Oregon legislature. So it's definitely on people's radars more, but it's also more on the federal radar again too. So there's some interesting news briefs. You could probably just Google the Southeast Power Pool. I don't have my map up here, but it's not, is it the Southeast Power Pool? It's the Southeast region, and the Southeast region is very similar to our region in that it's more balkanized, and like you said, with the 30 organizations,
Right.
or give or take 10 or 5 or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot of balkanized aspects to the transmission system in the Pacific Northwest and in the Southeast. And the Southeast is really looking at, I think, an RTO light or some kind of pooled mechanisms down there. So it's gaining attention down there. It's got some attention up here. And I think FERC is also kind of pulling out its magnifying glass again to kind of give that a closer look. So I think, knowing all that, I would say stay tuned. We have a study bill here. So stay tuned to that. And then also pay attention to what's happening in other parts of the country and at the national level too on that.
Okay.
That's a really good point. And I pulled up CAISO because that's been another big eye opener for me, is that neither Odo nor Oregon's PUC actually has the statutory authority to even access the level of information that would be really helpful in supporting any kind of our state planning activities, in the same way that California, their CAISO does. You can literally just pull up almost instantaneously who's generating what and where the use and the power flows are going in California's grid. We do not have that capacity either technologically nor statutorily in the state. So it's pretty fascinating what happens when you cross the state line. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thanks again, Jason. That was awesome. Awesome presentation. And I know you put a lot of work into that. And Also, for those of you who don't know Jason or don't regularly interact with Department of Energy, know that they're a wonderful resource and always pick up the phone when you call. So encourage you to do so if you had any other follow-up questions.
Yeah, certainly. Send me an email if you know it's right. Well, I guess my screen might not be sharing anymore, but Shannon has it. Reach out to Shannon.
Cool. Thanks, everybody. We will talk to you next month.
Okay. All right.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.